Before I start this video, I will say that I have been fairly ill recently. Still got a very sticky chest, so I may end up doing a lot of editing to keep the video short, whilst I have severe coughing fits. I'm doing okay now, having a lot of medication, but right now, that's just where I am. But in terms of the video, I want to make something very clear. Due to my lack of theological academia, I'm not in a position to gainsay many prominent theologians. If my studies of experimental theology were to become an academic course, I would further explain we are not here to rewrite the Bible or uproot Christian understandings of God. The purpose of this is to re-examine different perspectives and offer alternatives to the standard dogmatic lines. Not to remove people from the path of God, but to show them it's not always going to be as straightforward as some might claim. If God made this world to be so dynamic and alive, even allowing the devil to rebel to spice things up a bit, we can't hammer things into a straight line. This video, and others like it, are controversial. So if you don't agree with the ideas presented, that is entirely your choice. And by all means, fall back on your own ideas, own areas of expertise, or debate them with me. I always welcome that, and the comments are open for that purpose. So with all that out of the way, let's begin, and I'll try to keep it short despite my coughing fits. Everyone knows the general story of Jesus' birth, life, ministry, crucifixion, and resurrection. However, there are many factors that get overlooked by the majority of his followers in this day and age, who bury their heads in the pages of the Gospel and refuse to accept any other alternative views, some of which can make Jesus far more powerful as a character and settle any dispute some people have. So let's look at these aspects surrounding Christ and see what can be learned from them. Firstly, the circumstances of his birth. Born of the Blessed Virgin, incarnated from the Holy Spirit, begotten, not made, and God with us. Many critics would point out that it's highly unlikely, if not impossible, for a so-called virgin to have a child without any form of sexual intercourse. Whilst that's true for the most part, this is a phenomenon not unknown in nature. Parthenogenesis is a process where females can give birth to live young without the need for a male to fertilise their eggs. This is mostly seen in reptiles, some fish, and occasionally amphibians, but has been artificially induced in mammals, though never seen in the wild. Whilst human parthenogenesis has never been observed and is likely impossible, if human scientists can achieve it in mammals, it's well within God's power to perform. Thus, as the song says, Christus est natus, ex Maria Virgine. Christ is born of the Virgin Mary. His time of birth. According to the common understanding, Jesus was born in midwinter, the day which is celebrated with Christmas. This gets disputed for many reasons. It was a pagan holiday adopted by the Catholic Church. It was far more likely to be in spring or autumn by the actions of the shepherds, and the story of how John the Baptist was born implies it's in September, and so on. Firstly, records show that a celebration similar to Christmas was celebrated some 70 years before the pagan festival of Deus Natalis Solis Invicti, the birth of the unconquered sun, and was even popular before the theory of the Easter time conception was canonised. Second, all the dates suggested for the more accurate birth of Christ fall in times that farmers of Israel would have been busy with the harvest. Well, it's not slap bang at the end of summer, as we do it in Britain. A simple chart of Israel's agriculture shows that between April and November, harvesting would have been well underway. And more show that planting would have been happening between January and early December. If a census of the people was to happen at any point during that time, it would have been an issue for the supply of the Roman Empire. Granted, in late summer and early autumn, there would be more focus on less important grains and fruits, like figs and olives, but these are also delicacies enjoyed by the elite, who would have been the ones ordering the census in the first place. So they'd probably think, we don't want to miss out on our delicacies. The only time that nothing would have been done in the fields would have been during December. Hence, a more sensible time to call for people to return home, or at least to a big city for the census. And to give you an idea of how little temperature change is needed to affect the crops, I was working in Queensland, Australia during the Australian winter. It was still pretty darn warm, and they were saying that the temperature was affecting the banana crop, so they couldn't bring people in. That tells you how sensitive some fruits can be. But why return to the city of birth? Well, if records were to be kept, they would most likely have been done in bigger cities, with temples, synagogues or libraries, making cross-referencing age and numbers of children easier. Furthermore, many censuses were done throughout the centuries of Rome, so odds are one would have happened well within that time period. As for the story of John the Baptist, many people point out the reaction of the fetus of John in Luke chapter 1 verse 41, as a sign that John knew Jesus was there and leapt for joy in Elizabeth's womb. However, the verse states clearly that this was when Mary called out a greeting to Elizabeth, and that was what John reacted to. The anti-abortion crowd claimed that this is proof life begins at conception, but since it was clear that the term apasmos used in the verse which means a greeting, this was Mary's greeting of her relative that John responded to, and not Jesus in zygote, fetal, or even preconceptual stage of development. And so it's very hard to say that Christ was conceived at that time. Since the time between Mary being informed by Gabriel of her impending childbirth and her visit to the home of Zachariah is rather ambiguous, to say the least, we have no idea at what stage of development Jesus was at that time. One more thing. In verse 35 of that chapter, Gabriel said to her, "The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the Highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore also that the holy thing which shall be born to thee shall be called the Son of God." The Greek doesn't give an exact verb, as we would understand it, but the translation notes state that it was in the future tense, clearly implying the conception hasn't happened at that moment, but is going to happen. When is never stated, so we can't use John's story to give us an idea of the birth of Jesus. For all we know, he was born at Christmas. The shepherds, that's an interesting one, but they were probably poor, couldn't afford to pay someone to care for their sheep and found it easier to travel with them to the city to seek shelter and get registered. There's a lot more into that, really. His ethnicity. Many portraits and murals depict Christ throughout his ministry, crucifixion, and ascension. However, with all these painted images being done many increasing years later, showing what Christ looked like is very much left up to the artist. The majority of them opt to give him the likeness of those who shall behold the artwork, namely giving them the colour and features of the local population. This means most Westerners believe Jesus was white, and in some cases even blonde, which and me and my standard look rather Christ-like, unintentional by the way, and the occasional nickname Jesus, which I never looked for by the way. It doesn't help that the Bible doesn't describe Jesus in any way other than his actions, further showing the Gospels are accounts rather than stories, since most bars were painted a picture of him in words. However, we do get an idea of how he appears relative to his disciples. In the Gospels, it was obvious that the priests, Pharisees and Romans couldn't tell him apart from dozens of others at their party, and even tells them he's been at the temple, and even he tells them that he's been in the temple many times. It's only when Judas revealed him by kissing him and he openly admitted to being the one that they sought that they arrested him. Furthermore, when he taught in the temple and the Pharisees were dragging him out, clearly intending to throw him off a cliff, he was able to slip away through a crowd baying for his blood. This shows he isn't drastically different from the average person in the region at the time, and obviously couldn't be picked out at a glance. True, he was a Nazarene, but either there were enough people of Nazarene appearance in his disciples to make that just as helpful in a game of Guess Who as asking for their skin tone, or it wasn't a big enough difference to stand out. In short, we might like to think we would recognise Jesus if we saw him on a street, but odds are we wouldn't know him from the next average Jose, unless someone who did know him pointed him out or introduced us. His gender. Now, I know this is going to blow up here, but hear me out. We look to Jesus as the Son of God, who came to earth and was made man. I'm sure that the names given by the prophets are masculine. However, if we are to accept that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin and thus by parthenogenesis, we have to accept the limitations brought on by that means of producing life. In all cases, parthenogenesis only produces the female genetics, because the genetics of the female are the only ones available, meaning only female X chromosomes would be available. But Jesus was circumcised, and that wouldn't have been possible if he weren't male. Except for one phenomenon that many transphobic people never mention or address. Ben Shapiro, a political and religious speaker on many topics, including transgender, once raised a good point about identifying a child's sex at birth. That's being its genitalia. So some of the opinion that unless single occupant unisex cubicles completely replace communal shared public restrooms, that people should use the bathroom designed for the equipment they have, I'm inclined to agree with him on this principle. I've already done a video on this, so check out the the issue with transgenderism. However, what if someone was present or was to present as one sex externally, and yet genetically be the other sex? Is this even a thing? Well, yes it is. It's called hermaphroditism. A tricky thing to say at the best of times, especially when I'm skinful and when I've got a bad throat. It comes in several forms and has been known in humans and animals. While some animals, like frogs and clownfish, can switch sexes depending on circumstances, in humans it's often more of a mix of hormones that causes these genitalia to present differently or even blend in weird ways. The two types I'm mentioning here are known as 46XY and 46XX. This is when the genetic male has undescended testicles, thus presenting as female externally. Meanwhile, the genetic female can have an engorged clitoris, which can resemble a penis and a fused labia. Since this is hard to detect at a glance in infancy and around puberty, most adolescents will be clothed for the most part, it's hard to diagnose without proper tests and scans that wouldn't have been available at the time. It's put upon noting qualified nurses and maternity staff have mentioned that there are children born with very androgynous genitalia. So it's far from the be-all end-all of sex determination at a glance. In short, Christ may have been the Son of God in spirit and name, raised as a man in all things, only to be a woman. Shocking, I know. 3 things to raise here. Most men back in that day had beards. True, but hormonal imbalances to the point of presenting male is not inconceivable. So, since some testosterone creams can actually affect women to the point where they end up with facial hair that they need to constantly wax or shave, it's not unreasonable to believe that this same imbalance would have given Christ the common beard. What about the genital displays in early artworks? Well, back in those days, the Greeks and Romans believed that a large phallus was indicative of low intelligence, since graven or carven images of Christ wouldn't have been allowed by the zealots that destroyed many artefacts. The true details of Christ's family jewels remain a mystery. Also, one thing I failed to mention, I think it's in the Gospel of Luke. No, I don't remember which Gospel it's in, but it's the one where Jesus is taken to be circumcised. And the priest takes one look at him and says, "He's the one who's promised," or something along those lines. He recognises Jesus. Possibly a later prophecy by a lesser known prophet tells us someone with androgynous genitalia going to be circumcised, and he is very much going to be the Christ. There's no evidence of that, and I'm pretty sure Christians and atheists will say, I'm just making up stuff. It's a hypothesis, so I'm leaving it out there. Lastly, someone who claimed to have found the Ark of the Covenant said that it was below the place where Christ was crucified, and that it had blood on it, that only had 24 chromosomes. Quite apart from the fact that the source was never given, it's unlikely that the blood would be readable after 2,000 years. And they fail to realise the fact that because only a female could produce a female, it proves Christ was a woman, assuming they understood even that. Since most likely they would have ignored that particular part. Many also claim that the Shroud of Turin, which was claimed to be the burial cloth of Jesus, held currently in the Vatican, I think, has blood showing 25 chromosomes. However, due to terrible flaws in testing and questionable accounts of its history, the true origin of the shroud remains disputed. I know Mestron did a fantastic video on it that has really left me with no other clues of whether it's true or not. It's very much open to debate. And I agree with him, the test needs to be done again. As I said, I'm not a historian or a theologian, but from what my studies have shown me, some of the things we take for granted when we think of Jesus may not be as straightforward as we might expect. So despite what some people say, don't be afraid to look at things in a different way. There are stories about people getting abused, bullied, and all manner of horrendous things for simply raising interesting questions. But curiosity was never a sin. And in fact, in Proverbs chapter 14, verse 15, it says, "Only simpletons believe everything they are told, but the prudent carefully consider their steps." So, keep searching. Be prudent. Stay safe. And God be with you, my friends.